Well, Divinity got nerfed. Well, it will be nerfed in Season 19, which means we have a few more weeks of Divinity in its current state. It has been 3 years of its complete endgame dominance since it was revealed in Shadowkeep in the Garden of Salvation raid. It will now be a 15% damage weakness versus a 30% damage weakness, which now actually matches the strength of the weakness keyword itself from Void. Today, I want to talk about the implications of its nerf, what all this means going forward for the future of raiding and high-end content. When it comes to the actual nerf that Divinity received, Bungie did confirm that this was months in the making, with Bungie monitoring Div months before it was brought up on social media, even being mentioned on a community podcast where designers appeared on said podcast, again, well before it was ever brought up on social media. As much as people may not want to believe it, this was not Bungie reacting to people talking about Divinity and then making a spur-of-the-moment decision to nerf it. While I am surprised that it happened, this was in the making for a while. As many people predicted, Bungie has indeed been scaling boss health with Divinity in mind in raids, which essentially means that they build bosses knowing that people will be dealing 30% more damage to a target, also while hitting all crits with near permanent uptime. The way people talk about Divinity makes it seem like it deals 0 damage, which is not true either. It deals, a nice little chunk of damage on its own. So what this now means is that Bungie no longer needs to scale boss health with this 30% permanent debuff in mind. This 30% debuff that has 95 to 99% uptime. At best, you'll have 15% weakness with 95 to 99% uptime, which now opens the door for other weakness type effects to be integrated into encounters, even though most other weakness effects are the same in strength, but a much shorter duration. Tractor Cannon and Shadow Shot will be the main big debuffs going forward. I saw a lot of takes that claimed that Bungie wasn't going to tune future bosses with this knowledge in mind, which is just some of the most ignorant stuff I think you could possibly say regarding this topic, along with many other ignorant takes, but I digress. If Divinity were to remain the way it was, then the only way to make things like Shadow Shot and Tractor interesting again in terms of debuffs was to power creep them well ahead of Divinity, which was not going to be a good idea. Does this nerf make Divinity useless now? No, it does not. It is still going to be a very, very good option for many teams out there, and in fact for, I'd say, the majority of teams, nothing will change about their strategies as normal mode raid damage requirements are not very strict at all. Now, you might hit me with some math and say, oh, well, 5 people doing 130% damage with Divinity is 650%, 6 people doing 100% damage without Divinity, that's 600%. Now it's 5 people doing 115% damage, that's only 775%, which is less than 6 people just dealing damage without Divinity. And that is true. But without Divinity, people are much more susceptible to missing crits, especially depending on what kind of boss they are fighting, which means that 600% isn't actually 600% all the time unless your team literally never misses. Divinity now gives a lesser reward, but it gives you less risk when it comes to crits, which, considering the current meta of linear fusion rifles, is pretty important. When a lot of your damage relies on high uptime and hitting 4th times and triple tap procs, having a giant crit spot is pretty good to enable that uptime. This now puts the onus of risk on the individual team. Do we have someone use Divinity and just make our lives a little bit easier, but do less damage? Or do we risk doing less damage by trying to stack multiple debuffs one after another and not having the security of a giant crit spot? I think unless the meta shifts to non-crit weapons, Divinity will continue to be amazing. In fact, let's take a look at every single available raid encounter or raid boss in the game and determine whether or not Divinity will still be good. Last Wish. The first 2 bosses have different crit multipliers that actually makes Divinity bad for these encounters, so that's a wash. Morgeth has a gigantic crit spot, probably one of the biggest in the entire game, and such little health that this basically doesn't even matter. Divinity, no Divinity, who cares? You're going to kill him in 5 seconds. Riven's crit spot was almost impossible to miss, so the only reason people were using Divinity here was for the damage debuff, and that's it. This raid is so outdated anyway that it's basically irrelevant, and that damage phases are so short anyway that a couple of weakness grenades are going to be more than fine. Next, Garden of Salvation. The Consecrated Mines encounter definitely has some solid Divinity use cases, given that the boss actively floats and strafes away from you, making debuffing much more difficult and causing teams to have to front load their damage. And Sanctified Mind just enjoys the 30% damage reduction currently, although I feel like there's been some shenanigans with Divinity on this boss that I just really don't remember anymore, because I have Divinity already, and I have not run Garden in months. Next, Deepstone Crypt. We don't use Divinity anywhere except for Taniks, who has a somewhat annoying crit spot to hit, and Divinity will continue to be good here because of that fact. It is better to be able to hit consistent crits pretty much all the time versus trying to stack other debuffs and missing your shots. Obviously, there's some math we could do to try to figure out how often you're able to miss for certain things to be better than other things and blah blah, but I don't think there's much of a point to covering that because there's never a time where you want to not crit. Tractor Cannon may come into play here at some point for those who are comfortable hitting crits since the boss is within melee range, but most teams are going to continue to use Divinity. How about Vault of Glass? The Templar's crit, not that hard to hit, but it's mainly the fact that Templar constantly spins and moves around, which means unless you're using non-critting weapons like rockets, Divinity will still be good here, although I think people are using rockets. I don't even know what people are using right now. Atheon will also value Divinity quite heavily because Atheon's crit spot is very annoying, and Atheon also constantly moves around, so having that buffer is very nice. How about Vow of the Disciple? The Caretaker encounter both likes and dislikes Divinity. The crit spot can occasionally get hidden within the actual model of the Caretaker itself, but there's enough movement from the boss that Divinity is still valuable for a consistent crit experience. And obviously Rolk still values Divinity because of his high mobility and kind of small head and small crit spots. Finally, we have King's Fall, which is where the nerf feels like it's going to hit the hardest because damage phases in King's Fall are just so long. Divinity's uptime is what will make an encounter versus having to chain together multiple effects back to back to back for upwards of a minute. The War Priest's head, it's not too hard to hit, but the boss moves around enough that it's nice to have that safety net. Plus the fact that War Priest can flinch you very often makes widening that crit spot all the more helpful. For Golgroth, teams have been using Tractor Cannon since Golgroth's crit is very easy to hit, and you only have 4 people in the pit doing damage. With a Divinity and the math we used earlier, 3 people at 130% damage is not higher than 4 people at 100% damage. Plus, you can have the Taunters use Tractor Cannon, making now 4 people at 130% damage, which is way better than trying to use Divinity, although the uptime on Tractor Cannon is a bit more skill-based. The Daughter's encounter suffers a lot from flinch during damage phases, but that's not because of the Daughters themselves, that's from the enemies that spawn in that everyone completely ignores because you're all immune to damage. If you kill the enemies that spawn in, there's no more flinch, which makes crits very easy. One Storm Grenade should clean up a lot of those problems. Teams are still using rockets on both normal and master, which reduces the need for Divinity a little bit. And Oryx has a gigantic crit spot that is very tough to miss. Although something like Shadow Shot I don't think is working super well at the moment, but not for gameplay or damage debuff stacking reasons. It seems more like that's an Oryx hitbox situation and Oryx's character model itself being kind of the issue. So Divinity is still going to be good in the spots outside of the 30% damage debuff it was previously giving. Reducing it down to 15% opens the door for other debuffs to make their way into the game. Tractor Cannon is a pretty true sacrifice of damage since you don't get a heavy weapon to use anymore. I guess outside of plinking away with an Arbalest, which is still pretty good. But Tractor Cannon is 30% now. It also has a very strict requirement. You need to be in shotgun range. That's the trade-off. Shadow Shot will return to being actually important for damage cycles, giving a 30% debuff as well, but something like Quiver's damage is actually really good. So it's not the worst thing in the world, not to mention it's void. So Hunter can shadow shot into a weakness grenade, into a weakness smoke bomb. That's a nice utility play right there. The only other thing that gives a 30% damage debuff is Fellwinter's Helm, but that's not exactly reliable at all. I don't think anyone is going to force Hunters back into Shadow Shot, except in the most extreme of circumstances, but it does give Hunters some debuff utility again in the form of being the best debuff in terms of percentages, damage debuff percentages. The only major player in the 20% damage debuff column is Sundering Glare, which is a seasonal mod, which is around in Season of Plunder, but it's not always going to be around, so we can't really rely on this. And then we have the 15% debuff, which is basically everything else that encompasses the weakness keyword. Child of the Old Gods, Stylish Executioner, Snare Bomb, Echo of Undermining. Then you have Collective Obligation, which can siphon weakness, and the very unknown weapon, Heart Shadow, which I would like to explore in the future if it makes for a good or valuable video. Otherwise, I don't have much new to say on Divinity that I didn't say in the previous Divinity video. Having something be the best and the easiest is just a bit much, and I know we're in a sandbox right now where quite literally people are wiping out entire rooms of Grandmaster Nightfall enemies with one button press, but hey, it was a very good 3-year run, and Divinity is still not going anywhere. It is still going to get plenty of use in many, many teams. I think it'll still be used in Grandmaster Nightfalls, as people tend to use Divinity for the instant overload stun, plus a little damage boost for your champion killing needs. However, it might not feel as necessary in GMs because the damage boost you get isn't as substantial, perhaps opening up the field. But yeah, you know, not the end of the world. It was never going to be the end of the world. It just opens the door for some more options and flexibility, and maybe closes the door on power creep just a little bit. Just a little bit. Thank you for watching. I'll see you next time.